Is this the end of a secret that has been closely guarded by the most influential management in South Korea? Or is it just the beginning of a storm that will destroy the harmony that has been built for years? Check out Chris Martin's unexpected confession that left the world speechless and Jimin at the nadir of his panic in an event that modern music history will never forget. Before we dive deeper into this vortex of shocking truth, make sure you give your support by clicking the like button, writing your theory in the comments, and clicking subscribe and turning on a notification bell so as not to miss the continuation of this exclusive investigation. Have you ever imagined a moment in which a single short sentence spoken in a relaxed tone by a legend of world music could bring down a defensive wall that has been built so solidly over the years? What would happen if a figure as warm as Chris Martin, Coldplay's lead vocalist known for his wisdom and closeness to the members of BTS, suddenly made a statement that not only shocked the public, but also made a Jimin lose his composure in front of thousands of pairs of eyes? The global entertainment world is suddenly in an uproar, not because of a cheap scandal or baseless rumor, but because a truth seems to slip from the tongue of someone who should be the most trusted keeper of secrets. Behind the glittering stage lights and smiles that are always plastered on the glass screen, there is a narrative that is much darker and more complex than fans around the world have ever imagined. It began in an exclusive recording studio in London, a place that was supposed to be a safe space for creativity, but instead turned into an inevitable emotional battleground for Jimin and Jungkook. The tension does not simply arise from a vacuum, but rather is an accumulation of stresses that have been simmering beneath the surface for months since the start of a secret collaborative project involving Chris Martin as executive producer. On a cold night in January 2026, as a thick fog envelopes the city of London, a live interview session that was originally planned as a regular promotional event turns into a moment that will go down in history as a breaking point for Jimin. Chris Martin, who was talking in his trademark relaxed and enigmatic style, suddenly mentioned a name that made the atmosphere in the room instantly freeze: Jungkook. However, instead of just mentioning names, Chris made a claim that implied that Jungkook was preparing something that had been hidden even from his own group mates, especially Jimin. Jimin's eyes, which usually radiated warmth and calm, in an instant turned into a real flash of panic, a spontaneous reaction that was captured by the camera very clearly before the show's producers tried to divert the conversation. The big question is, why would Jimin, who is known as one of the most emotionally stable figures in BTS, react so violently to statements about his closest friend? Is there a hidden agreement that has been broken? Or has Chris Martin accidentally opened a Pandora's box containing Jungkook's future plans that will change the map of the K-pop industry forever? The public began to wonder if this had to do with the contract in question, or if there was a much deeper personal issue involving their professional relationship. Speculation began to wildly circulate on social media, creating a wave of uncertainty that forced the agency to tightly close all information doors. But Jimin's reaction was already irrefutable evidence. The cold sweat that soaked his temples and the way he squeezed his own hands gave a strong signal that what Chris Martin said was not just a joke or a mispronunciation. Inside the soundproof studio, the sound of a heartbeat sounded as if it were louder than the background music playing. Chris Martin, with eyes that were hard to decipher, continued to speak as if he was unaware of the emotional outburst he had just triggered. He spoke of the courage to go it alone and the sacrifices Jungkook had to make for a greater vision. These words hit Jimin like a big sledgehammer. For Jimin, Jungkook is not just a coworker. He is his brother, best friend, and part of his soul in this very harsh industry. Inside this soundproof studio, the sound of a heartbeat sounded as if it were louder than the background music playing. Chris Martin, with eyes that were hard to decipher, continued to speak as if he was unaware of the emotional outburst he had just triggered. He spoke of the courage to go it alone and the sacrifices Jungkook had to make for a greater vision. These words hit Jimin like a big sledgehammer. For Jimin, Jungkook is not just a coworker. He is his brother, best friend, and part of his soul in this very harsh industry. knowing that something very big is going on without her knowledge, or worse, something Jungkook is hiding from her, creates a sense of betrayal mixed with deep worry. Jimin's facial expression at that time was a mixture of disbelief, hurt, and fear of losing something very valuable. The incident was further complicated by the fact that a few weeks earlier, Jungkook had been seen spending time alone in an outdoor studio, away from the scrutiny of the other members. Rumors of a revolutionary solo project have long been heard, but Chris Martin's statement gives it a different dimension, as if this project is a permanent exit, not just a side activity. Jimin, who has always been Jimin, who has always been the first to defend and support Jungkook, suddenly feels alien in the middle of a conversation involving the future of the person he cares about most. The camera continues to record every little detail of Jimin's panic, how he tries to force a smile that looks so fragile, and how his eyes continue to seek refuge in the shadows of the staff standing behind the screen. However, the real surprise was not only in Jimin's reaction, but in Chris Martin's calmness when delivering details that were supposed to be top secret. Was Chris trying to warn Jimin? Or is it being ordered by certain parties to leak this information to see how the market reacts? In an industry full of manipulation and high-level marketing strategies, anything is possible. However, the emotions Jimin showed were too pure to be called acting. It was the panic of a human being who felt his world was shaking violently. It was as if he was in the middle of a storm he had not been invited to, and the only person who could give an answer, Jungkook, was in a very distant place, both physically and emotionally. At that moment, as the interview session went on, the atmosphere was increasingly tense. Every time Jungkook's name was mentioned, the interview session went on, the atmosphere was increasingly tense. Every time Jungkook's name was mentioned, Jimin looked like a person deprived of oxygen. He repeatedly corrected his sitting position, touched his hair with restless movements, and tried to give his manager a code to end the session immediately. However, Chris Martin is ostensibly on a mission to finish what he has started. He started talking about a new contract and an international deal that would put Jungkook in a position that no Asian artist has ever achieved, but at a very high price: separation. The words farewell or permanent career solo are never said explicitly, but the subtext of Chris's every sentence leads to it very sharply. For industry observers, this is an anomaly. How could such important information come out of the mouth of an external collaborator before there was an official statement from the man? For industry observers, this is an anomaly. How could such important information come out of the mouth of an external collaborator before there was an... Outside the studio, fans watching the broadcast via streaming platforms began flooding the comments with questions filled with concern. Hashtags regarding Jimin's panic and Chris Martin's statement began to top the list of global trends in a matter of minutes. The world seemed to stop spinning just to pay attention to every word that came out of that London studio. The curiosity of the public reached its peak when Chris Martin closed one of the segments with the most devastating phrase for Jimin. Sometimes, in order to save oneself, one must leave the house that has raised him. That sentence was the last blow that Jimin was no longer able to restrain himself. He stood stiffly, gave a brief salute that looked very forced, and immediately left the room just before the broadcast was abruptly interrupted by the production. The events behind the scenes after the camera is turned off are even more dramatic. Reports from insiders said that Jimin immediately searched for a hidden place to try to contact Jungkook, but the magne's phone was not active. The panic that was only visible on the face now turned into an action filled with anxiety. Jimin reportedly had a heated argument with some agency staff who tried to calm him down. He demanded clarity on what Chris Martin had just said, while the staff themselves looked as confused as Jimin. The situation became very chaotic. Communication between the team in London and the headquarters in Seoul was interrupted due to the time difference and the sudden bureaucratic confusion. In the midst of the chaos, Chris Martin remained in his chair with a very calm expression, as if he had carried out a very arduous but necessary task. Chris' silence after the storm of statements only adds an even thicker layer of mystery. Did he deliberately trigger this panic to force Jungkook out of hiding? Or is there another, bigger motive involving global music industry competition at a higher level? Jimin, now in the car on his way back to his hotel, could only stare at the wet London streets with raging thoughts. He knew that from tonight on, things would never be the same again. His relationship with Jungkook, his position in the group, and their future careers are all on the edge of a cliff because of a statement he never expected. This tension not only belonged to Jimin, but also became a burden for the entire support team that was there. They realized that what happened that night will trigger a chain reaction that cannot be stopped. News began to spread to major media outlets around the world at the speed of light. International media began making headlines about the rift within BTS, with Jimin and Jungkook at the center of the drama. However, behind all the hustle and bustle, the core question remains unanswered. What exactly does Chris Martin know about Jungkook that is so terrifying to Jimin? And why did Jungkook choose to remain silent as this storm began to hit the people who cared about him the most? Jimin's journey to the hotel feels like an eternity. Each passing streetlight seemed to remind him of moments of togetherness now threatened by secrets he did not understand. He began to recall small conversations with Jungkook in recent months, trying to find clues he might have missed. Is there a different tone of voice? Is there a look in the eyes that implies parting? Jimin realizes that he may be too busy with his own world not to realize that the person closest to him is planning something that will drastically change both of their lives. Guilt began to slip into his heart, adding to the already suffocating burden of panic. Arriving at the hotel, Jimin did not immediately enter his room. He stood on the balcony, staring at the dark London night sky, trying to find answers among the stars covered with clouds. He knew that tomorrow morning, he would have to face the world with a million questions that he could not answer. He also knew that he had to meet Jungkook face to face, with no cameras, no manager, and no Chris Martin among them. However, the biggest fear inside him was the fact that maybe, just maybe, Chris Martin was telling the truth, that Jungkook was ready to go, and Jimin was the last person he told. The situation gets even more tense when a short message arrives on Jimin's cell phone from an unknown number. The message contained only one short sentence. "Don't look for answers you already know, Jimin." This mysterious message adds even more psychological pressure to Jimin. Who sent him? Is this part of a bigger plan? Or is this a warning from someone in Jungkook's inner circle? Jimin felt like he was walking on a thin layer of ice that could break at any moment. He is caught in a web of conspiracies and emotions that he does not understand the root cause. That night, no one could sleep peacefully. In another part of the world, in Seoul, the headquarters of their agency is on Alert 1. Emergency meetings were held in the middle of the night. Executives are trying to figure out how to put out the fire that Chris Martin has started. However, the more they try to cover it up, the more details leak to the public. Photos of Jimin leaving the studio with a deathly pale face began to spread widely, adding to the obvious evidence that something was very wrong. The world is now waiting with bated breath, waiting for an official statement or at least a word from Jungkook to defuse this storm. But Jungkook's silence is the scariest answer for everyone, especially for Jimin, who can now only sit limply in the corner of his room, lamenting the reality he has just faced. This uncertainty created a very heavy atmosphere, as if the air around Jimin became denser and harder to breathe. He began to think about the consequences of Chris Martin's statements on the future of the group he had built with sweat and tears. If Jungkook really decides to take a different step, what will happen to the rest of the members? How will they explain this to the fans who have given everything for them? These negative thoughts kept spinning in Jimin's head, sinking him into an endless maelstrom of panic. He felt very helpless, a feeling he had very rarely experienced throughout his glorious career. Every minute that passed without any news from Jungkook felt like torture for Jimin. He kept trying to call, send messages, and even contact other people close to Jungkook, but the results were nil. It was as if Jungkook had disappeared, swallowed up by the earth, right after Chris Martin's statement came out. This silence seemed to justify all of Jimin's greatest fears. He felt like he was watching a horror movie where he was the main character, but he didn't know how the story would end. His anxieties began to manifest themselves in physical form. His hands trembled and his heart beat with an irregular rhythm. He knows that he is on the verge of mental breakdown if he does not immediately get reassurance in the darkness of a night in London. Jimin realizes that he is facing an invisible enemy, a great secret that may end everything. Chris Martin's statement wasn't just words. It was a key that opened the door to a bitter new reality. And as Jimin gazes into his reflection in a mirror, he no longer sees a confident world idol, but a terrified young man struggling to hold on to the last thing he holds dear to his life. The real battle had just begun.